Ross, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on. Israeli Defense Forces have said that the Israeli Air Force struck around 140 targets across the Gaza Strip in the past 24 hours, hitting buildings used by terror groups, operatives, and military infrastructure. The Hamas-run Health Ministry has reported that at least 77 Palestinians were killed, including 21 in airstrikes on residential areas. Ground troops from 3 IDF divisions continue to push into Gaza City today. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks moved deeper into neighborhoods including Sabra, Tel al-Hawa, and Sheikh Radwan and al-Nasser, raising concerns about civilians sheltering in the city. The military offensive continues as they launched on September 16. They have forced hundreds to flee. These developments come as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to meet U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House tomorrow to discuss possible deal to end the conflict and secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas last year. Ahead of this meeting, thousands of Israelis rallied in Tel Aviv for a comprehensive deal to end the war and bring all hostages home, holding banners and urging immediate actions. Now for this discussion, we go back to Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you very much, Ross, for staying with us. Now, looking at this continued Israeli attack or Israel's military strikes on Gaza, what do you think Israel has left to say to the world in defense of the current situation in Gaza?
Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear in his speech to the United Nations last week. Israel is going to continue this war until Hamas is destroyed, and if that includes fighting within Gaza City, urban area where there's still civilians nearby, that's going to proceed. And it doesn't matter how much international criticism is made of Israel, Netanyahu's policies remain unchanged. So this is the situation that has been on the ground pretty much since the war began in October 2023. As the civilian casualties mounted, the war has continued. Israel really ignores the international criticism. And Netanyahu's made very clear what his goals are. His goal is the elimination of Hamas and the return of the hostages. Hopefully some of them are still alive, but if not, then the return of their remains. So these two goals, the defeat of Hamas, the complete defeat of Hamas, not some kind of partial defeat that leaves Hamas with its weapons or still in control of sections of Gaza. The defeat of Hamas and the return of hostages are Israel's goals. And no amount of international criticism causes Israel or Netanyahu to vary from that. So the fighting continues. And unfortunately, again, it comes at a high cost of civilian deaths and casualties.
Ross, we've also seen the opposition voice increase in Tel Aviv domestically as well as internationally towards the current Israeli government, also considering Israel's lack of cooperation with UN resolutions. Do you think Gazans or Palestinians still are hopeful about reaching a diplomatic approach, considering that tomorrow Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump are supposed to talk? What do you think will be reached, or do you think they should or they can stay hopeful for this?
One could stay hopeful about a ceasefire, but by its very nature, even if ceasefire is agreed to again, and there's been previous ceasefires, it would be of a limited duration. And then the question remains, what happens at the end of the ceasefire? If Hamas is not going to surrender as part of a ceasefire, then eventually the ceasefire will end and the war will resume, because Israel's goal is very clear, and that includes the complete defeat of Hamas. So although there's been talk of a ceasefire in recent days, and maybe President Trump would put pressure on Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, we have to keep in mind that a ceasefire would only be of limited duration, and it's not the equivalent to the true end of the war. From Israel's perspective, no matter international or even domestic criticism, as long as Netanyahu is in power in Israel, the war will only end once Hamas has been completely defeated.
And Ross, furthermore, what role do you think that United Nations can still play in strengthening the Palestinian cause and making peace between Palestine and Israel?
On this one, I'm sympathetic to President Trump's remarks at the UN last week. And it's very similar to other conflicts around the world, recent conflicts, that is. The UN has largely been absent. It still has a role in the delivery of aid to civilians in Gaza, but has it been a main player in ceasefire talks throughout this period of war that's now almost 2 years? The answer is no, it hasn't. And the key players in ceasefire talks have been Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, not the UN or the UN Secretary General. So if your question is what role does the UN have to play in ceasefire talks or reaching some kind of peace agreement, the answer is none. And the relationship between the Israeli government and the United Nations is very bad at the moment. So it's really unlikely that the UN will play any kind of political role. And in fact, Israel has made it clear that their willingness to allow the UN to play an aid delivery role is limited as well, which is why Israel has looked at and worked with the United States on alternative channels and methods to deliver aid to civilians in Gaza.
And Ross, lastly, what are Israel's responsibilities as an occupying force regarding the protection of Palestinian civilians under Oslo Agreement? And also
certainly,
international.
like any belligerent, Israel has obligations to minimize civilian casualties, and the Israeli position is that they've been doing that, and they've made that clear throughout the period of the war. Obviously, a lot of people around other governments around the world will disagree with Israel and say you're not doing enough to protect civilians, but Israel would say that Hamas is embedded in the civilian population. They're fighting from residential buildings, for example, and that's partly why the civilian death toll has been so high. That's not going to change, right? People are going to continue to accuse Israel of ignoring the safety of civilians, and Israel is going to continue to say that Hamas is embedded in civilian and residential areas, and that's going to continue until the war comes to an end.
With that, I would like to thank Ross Feingold for joining us and sharing your